So we're going to keep on challenging you now. So we've got 5 excellent speakers who are going to give you 15 minutes in terms of this kind of expanding conversation about urban remodelling, new development, governance, and actually start to bring this alive in terms of some examples or some research to actually start to get you to think even more this afternoon. They're all coming from very different backgrounds. I think this is the nature this afternoon. It's not about a single theme, but lots of different ideas to really get you to go back to your offices and your practices and actually think in a different way in terms of the whole idea of this conference. I'm going to start with Rory. I'm not sure how many people know Rory here, but he's very much a bit of a thought leader in terms of making sure that his practice, where he's a partner, is driving this debate, not just kind of talking about it at conferences, but really demonstrating exactly what can be achieved when we start to talk about master planning and multidisciplinary practices. So, Rory, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you through a case study of a piece of work we are in the middle of, really, still, but it's sort of at an interesting point in the process. And linking back to some of the earlier speakers about how decisions are taken in the planning process, how we listen to local people, how we assess local need, and so on, that there are some interesting lessons to be drawn from current practice. The practice that I'm a partner of, HTA Design, we're a multidisciplinary design practice, so we encompass architecture, urban design, master planning, sustainability, and town planning. So we try and bring together as many of the design disciplines, actually including landscape architecture, into one place under one roof, so we can collaborate effectively together on projects. So I think in this case, almost all of those disciplines were involved in this particular project. So a lot of interdisciplinary working together with WSP and AECOM dealing with all the engineering. So the project itself is the Aylesbury Estate, regeneration of the Aylesbury Estate, which is I think a 28-hectare site in the south of London, about a mile and a half that way. And it is very close to the centre of London, very close to the Elephant and Castle, and it has a long history of failed attempts at regeneration. I think Tony Blair visited the estate on his first day in office to say, we're going to solve this problem. We go to the planning committee in Southwark tomorrow evening with the master plan for regeneration and the first development detailed planning. So what's that, 16 years later? Why is this happening? Well, again, and reflecting back on a point in history where we needed to deliver lots of housing very quickly, and where we all, probably rooms full of people quite like us 60 years ago, thought we had the answer. We could see the future, we knew how people were going to live, and we could design places that were exciting, they were brighter, they were cleaner, they were simpler, they could be built more quickly, they elevated people up into the air, off the ground. They enabled them to drive everywhere by car because, of course, that was going to be the new sort of freedom that people had. And we were wrong in almost every respect. So, it's useful to reflect back on that when we make big plans and have big ideas. We think we know the future. Actually, we rarely do. So the people who moved into the estates, they probably had a really nice time for the first 6 months or so while everything was new. But then pretty quickly the buildings started leaking. They lost all connection with the ground. The ground floors are all garaging and access stairways. They couldn't find a way around. The postmen couldn't find where they were. So 40 years later, after a difficult time for many of those residents. There was a lot of consultation, a lot of discussion. Finally, there was an agreement that the only real solution was to demolish the estate and start from scratch, really, to wipe the slate clean and develop a new place on the site of the old, providing homes for all the people who are living there currently, as well as an influx of additional people, in part to make the whole thing stack up economically because of a lack of external political will and investment. So Southwark Council developed what's called an Area Action Plan, which is essentially a document which says what's going to happen, sets out the planning strategy for the site. And because of their experience in dealing with other regeneration projects in the borough, we had actually dealt with a very sophisticated, very experienced, very knowledgeable and effective team. So I suppose the answer to some of the problems we've been hearing about from Kate a moment ago is that this can be dealt with in a sequential way if you have a team who are involved, like any other discipline, like any other way of life or any other profession. You have to have people who know what they're doing, and they have to have been through the mill already. So, applying, say, a large regeneration project into a borough that has never done one of those before is probably not going to work. What you need to do is you need to bring in people from outside who have been through that and mix them in with some of the local knowledge. So, leading on from the Area Action Plan, then there was a bidding process which was won by Notting Hill. Notting Hill are a social landlord with, I think, about 45,000 homes in their ownership. And they essentially will become the owners and landowners of the affordable housing on the site, and will develop the private housing for sale. And also working with the Creation Trust, which is sort of remains of the NDC, the New Deal for Communities project, which took place on the estate. And this is the list of the main consultants. As I said, it's one of a number of regeneration projects in the borough, so we're dealing with a very sophisticated, knowledgeable team. And just reflecting on one particular issue where the AAP, the Area Action Plan, is almost a political tool for saying what will happen, and it sort of takes a simplified view. So, for example, here there are sort of green fingers leading from Burgess Park back up into the site, and we looked at the whole scheme again after the bidding process and said, well, actually, that's too simple a solution. It looks nice on a master plan, but actually it's too simple a solution. It's not sophisticated enough to deal with all the local characteristics of the different areas that the project has. It doesn't reflect the needs of the different neighbourhoods. So we still have the same amount of greenery, but it's in pockets and clusters, and each one, those pockets and clusters have different needs and fulfill different functions and have different kinds of play, have different kinds of trees, and so on. In terms of the timeline, we are, as I said, going for planning tomorrow, and then the first phase of about 800 units is expected to complete about 2021, and the final phase complete about 2032. So we're looking at a 16 or 17 year development project, which, and I would say that's the thin end of it. I think it'll probably go on for quite a bit longer than that. In terms of master plan principles, I think we've all learned a lot over the last decade or two about walkable cities, about how to design neighborhoods. So issues like how you break down the barriers between the old and the new. So the estate that we're demolishing was a very simplified brutalist model, and there was an extraordinary change between the surrounding neighbourhoods and the estate. Everybody knew where you lived when you said you lived on the Aylesbury, because it just looks different from everywhere else, and in most cases it towers above everything else. So a different modern kind of development is one where there's more of a seamless integration between the new and the old. So picking up on cues from things like conservation area to the northwest here, dealing with the park frontage. Actually a lot of the brutalist master plan kind of ignores the fact that it's beside one of the biggest parks in London. Linking into the street network, so continuing streets, in some cases recreating streets that were there 60 years ago and actually bringing them back to life at the moment, you can't get from east to west on the estate. You have to go down to Albany Road, walk along Burgess Park, and back up again. So actually recreating a pedestrian walkable network of streets, linking those together with open spaces, and linking into the existing neighbourhoods and the character of the neighbourhoods around the site to create sort of a new heart in the middle along Walworth Road. The social inclusion, making sure that there are new homes for all the affordable housing residents who are currently on site. So we're replacing 2,700 homes with 4,200 homes over the lifetime of the project. And all of this is being done, BRE will be glad to know, all this being done under the framework of the BREEAM communities. Interestingly, from a sort of purely urban design and architectural perspective, looking at the street network before the war, and then at least part of Burgess Park was created essentially by bomb damage. Other parts were created afterwards, and then the estate itself generated these enormous sort of black blobs of space and buildings. And then our plan is to really recreate or bring back grain, an urban grain, which is much more like the pre-war situation. So tying the streets together, making sure that there are clear paths and clear routes through the development, which much smaller, more sympathetic block sizes rather than the enormous ones that were there previously. Linking into the cycling network, so there's an extensive cycling network in Burgess Park and along some of the streets that are already there and well used, so making sure that we link into all of these things. And all of this requires endless discussion between, in the case of transport, I mean in London it involves discussion between TfL, between the local authority, between transport consultants, between the designers, the landscape architects, and so on. So this is a very, very complicated, difficult process requiring a lot of discussion, a lot of iterations in terms of the design, and almost always dissatisfaction, because nobody is ever fully satisfied with the result. So it's a sort of an interesting outcome of these sort of processes, that everybody engaged has to accept that, you know, their specialism won't necessarily be satisfied. You need all the specialists to be involved and engaged, but in the end, probably none of them are going to be totally happy. So trees, for example, keeping lots of trees, but we are building a lot more buildings than there were there before, so inevitably we have to clear away some other trees. But in the end, we're planting many more trees on streets than were there before. So the net outcome in the long term will be positive, but in the short term, there are always some negatives. Again, in terms of the building typologies, there are a lot of different character areas. So the sort of bright blue frontage to the park. As I said, this is a major park in London, really currently ignored by the buildings that are not really fronting it at all. Most other parks in London, like Hyde Park, have incredibly valuable development along them, and so these are the tallest, densest buildings in the scheme. So they will benefit from it. The views and light from the park, and the park will benefit from having a proper frontage, which it hasn't got at the moment. And then lower rise development to the northwest here, linking to the neighbouring conservation area. I think 60% of the land take will be housing, as in houses in terraces on streets. So although we're getting a lot more apartments into a more higher dense development on the southern frontage, we're also recreating a lot of terraced streets. In terms of the energy, there will be a heat network which will connect all the buildings, and that will be delivered in phases through a number of sub-energy centres which will be linked up through a heat main. Essentially, a lot of these are GLA policies, so in a place like London, regeneration of this kind of project, there's a lot of strong policy guidance and drivers already there. So we don't have to even think too hard about how we're going to solve this particular problem. The policy and the guidance and the direction is really already there. Our job is to make sure you can actually implement it and make sure that In this case, we can make sure that residents can afford to pay the fuel bills. So actually we've spent more time looking at the costs of how we deliver that than really the principle of whether it should be delivered or not. In the same way with green spaces, again, linking into the network of green spaces that are already there, the fact that there's an enormous park to the south means that the quality and the character of the green spaces we're providing can be a little bit different from how we might normally deal with it, because it's not as if people are going to have a shortage of green space to take advantage of. So that's reflected in the design of some of the buildings. So this will be a new and recognizable park edge. The park edge will probably be the thing that people will now, or say 10, 15 years hence, will recognize as being the sort of signature of the area. Totally pedestrian friendly and cycling friendly. And contemporary buildings which link into the character of existing areas. So there's no pastiche involved. The design is all fresh and modern. But scale and typology of the buildings will relate directly to the buildings that surround them. It's very residential-led because the site where it is between the Old Kent Road and the Walworth Road means there's a lot of perfectly good retail uses outside the site, so there's really no need for us to create competition for the existing businesses. So the main thing to do is to make sure we're putting in some additional public services here in the form of a doctor's surgery and a library and a chemist and a few other health-related uses, but all of the other main retail uses are outside the site. So it's a very residential-led master plan. And that's just showing the delivery of the numbers over the different phases, the new population. So the total new population at the end here, I think, is about 10,000 people versus a current of about 7,500. So quick flick through the phasing. So phase one here on the left is we're submitting an outline application for the entire master plan and a detailed application for phase one, which is 830 units, and they'll both be decided tomorrow. And then following on from that, then there will be other. That's the sub phase with the library and the doctor's surgery, then a large residential phase, another residential phase, and then the final residential phase. So it's interesting. In the master plan, what we've had to do is we've had to come up with, if you like, parameters of the design. In other words, buildings will be roughly this high, they will have roughly this number of units, because actually we don't know by 2030 how will people want to live. So the master plan has to be detailed enough to say it's going to be roughly this big and there's going to be roughly that many, but it could be less than this, but we have set a maximum. And it'll be interesting to us to see as time goes by how that flexibility built into the master plan survives against reality. You know, have we got the judgment about right, or do, say, changes in transport mean that actually densities can be higher, or do changes in experience of, say, behavior and social life on the site mean that actually density should be lower? The flexibility is there for both to happen, and we've tried not to be too deterministic about how we deliver that, other than by saying that, of course, that whatever happens, you should follow the principles of being walkable, friendly. All the activity should take place on the ground plane, entrances on every street, trees on every street, and so on. So some statistics. So the overall, there's about 50% affordable over the whole master plan, and with new community facilities, and as I said, 800 homes or so on the first development site. Some of the analysis that we did about things like microclimate and so on is interesting, because it just shows the sort of impact of some megastructures on the climate. So on the left hand side, they both use about wind pressure. So on the left is the proposal, on the right is the previous master plan. So these sort of stark changes in how the urban environment feels when you build these very large buildings, which are sort of monotenure, monocultural, and really not really designed in the sort of more sophisticated way using the tools we have available to us today. You could say, well, they didn't know, but on the other hand, I suspect that if they'd really looked around at how other buildings worked, even using their intelligence. They probably could have figured it out. Looking at how much solar incidence there are in facades for things like PV and for daylight and for comfort and overheating. Looking in detail at the units themselves, at how they perform in terms of daylight and overheating. We looked at the range of temperatures over 3 types of climate change scenarios, for example, to make sure we weren't designing buildings that are going to massively overheat. And then this is the sort of summary of the BREEAM community standard. We're on the cusp of going from very good to excellent, so depending on how things work out over the next month or so, we hope to get an excellent rating for the project. As I said, most of the density is on the southern end, overlooking the park, so you can see the different types where you have the sort of highest density in pink, and then lower density in the dark blue, and then the lowest density, which is really terraced housing, in the light blue. We developed the typologies of blocks. So here what we're trying to do is we're trying to mix different building heights within the same block. So trying to make sure that even though we have high density in some areas, it's not so high that it's impossible to put other blocks alongside it. So it's about balancing the needs for daylight and ventilation and sunlight to penetrate into blocks. So making sure that we've got gaps in them. So even when they're up to 25 or 30 stories in some areas, that you have down to 3-4 stories in other areas, and then gaps between them to allow them to function in terms of the microclimate, but also splitting up the blocks so that each block has a recognizable entrance. There are lots of doors on the streets. There are lots of lobbies. There are lots of movement of people to and from these buildings and along the streets, because what you need in a healthy functioning urban environment is you need lots of people, lots of pedestrian activity and cycling activity. So again, all the cycling accesses are all from the streets, and then as the blocks lower in density, the lower in building height and the number of apartments and convert into housing, and then a sort of a brick-based architecture which relates to that. Also a set of detailed street types which again are dealt with, dealing with the cycling and the walking, and the still requirement for parking, but it's interesting that in Southwark over the last 10 years, even though they've added about 10,000 homes to the borough, they've decreased car ownership by 2,000. So there's an interesting and continuing trend in urban areas of car ownership declining, and the need to accommodate cars in these developments. We still have, in the first development site, we still have, out of 3 blocks, we have 2 podia where there's parking under the podia, and we're hoping that by the time we get to sort of future phases with dense accommodation, that we'll be able to get rid of things like podia, because they're unhelpful. Burying them is expensive, building them is expensive, and ideally we wouldn't have them at all. And you can see here in terms of the design and the architecture of the buildings themselves that even within a single block there might be 4 or 5 building typologies within the block. So lots of variety in the design. And in the end, instead of something which you can see from the moon and recognize as the Aylesbury Estate, you've got something which kind of blends in quite nicely with the surrounding area. The urban grain is pretty similar. The squares are similar to other London squares. The streets look like other London streets. So apart from probably the green roofs and PVs, it won't be that recognizable from the air as being a massively different, massively new development. And in fact, some of the rooftops are accessible amenity spaces as well, which actually we expect to be really spectacular. Okay, so these are some images of the first development site in detail. It has an extra care older persons building here as well. So we've, in the scheme overall, while there is a mixture of affordable and private homes, there's also some specialist homes for particular types of people, and some views from Burgess Park of the development as it's currently planned. The lower rise housing near the conservation area, the view from Albany Road. And that's it. So I'll look forward to your questions a little bit later on.
Thank you, Rory. As I said before, some really good, hard, practical examples of what can be done. I think Rory's comment about maybe sometimes the best thing to do is to start again was quite an important point. So moving seamlessly, Rory mentioned several times BREEAM communities. Helen Pineo, who's going to speak to us next, was the author of the latest BREEAM community scheme, so lots of experience and lots of knowledge. Helen now leads our work on cities, and is going to be talking to us about health and cities and urban areas. So, thank you.
So just wanted to go back to the brief for this session, which is about balancing rapid urban growth with long-term sustainability, and look at that through the lens of health, because actually health is an issue that is cross-cutting across so many other city challenges in terms of costs that the NHS pays to take care of us, energy costs, energy and the design of buildings and how buildings use energy impacts on our health, climate change impacts on health. So actually by looking at this issue, we're covering off lots of different sustainability areas as well. And of course, with the rapid growth of cities and growth in the UK needed in terms of housing, we need to understand how the urban environment either promotes or detracts from our health so that we can get these developments and the design right. But as we'll get into, it's actually quite a complicated and difficult to really understand area, so it's very interesting. My background is planning, but I'm, as Martin said, leading on our cities program for BRE, so have been doing quite a lot of research over the last 6 months across a range of city topics, and that was summarized in the Cities as Systems report, which you'll see outside. And healthy cities was actually one of the topic areas within our BRE Trust Future of Cities research program. But BRE has actually been looking at health and health in the built environment for quite a long time. So our background to our organization has been discussed previously, and we've been around for a long time, government funded, and in the earlier stages of our organization, we have looked at sick building syndrome, the impact of the design of the building on occupants in terms of indoor air quality, noise, daylighting, lots of issues like that. But what we started to do with our Future Cities research program was expand that out into the macro urban level. What's the impact of things like transport and green space, the overall quality of housing, but also access to education, jobs, etc. And that goes into the planning realm, and hence my interest in that area. This type of macro issue in looking at health starts to go into what are called the wider determinants of health. And actually, these have a big impact on our health. The Marmot review, which was done at UCL by Michael Marmot and his team, demonstrated that the wider determinants of health really do have a big impact on us, and that's more about prevention rather than cure. So it's about the environments that we live in, whether we have jobs, whether we have access to education, all of those points. So it really is quite an interesting area. But in terms of cities, we think about what Kate Henderson was showing us with the Victorian times and smog and industry and overcrowding. There's a perception that cities aren't good for health, but there's a lot of growing research that demonstrates that cities can actually be very good for health. And there's something called an urban health advantage, which suggests studies around the world have demonstrated that in many different countries, people living in urban areas are actually healthier than their rural counterparts. And that's to do with things like the wider determinants of health. So by moving into a city, getting access to jobs and education that isn't available in rural areas in other countries. But the urban health advantage isn't consistent around the world, and it's not the case that by living in a city, you are definitely going to be healthier, because within cities, there are huge inequalities. And so what the Marmot review was really doing was about demonstrating that social inequalities have a huge impact on health, and there are health inequalities associated with that. So poorer people generally have worse health. And that's, of course, linked to your environment. So where you live, if you live in a poor environment with low-maintained public spaces and buildings, houses, etc., that affects your health. So it's a really an area that planners have been dealing with for a long time, but it does require collaboration across public health professionals and built environment professionals. So this is an image of Collyhurst Village in Manchester, which I visited as a part of the UK GBC conference on cities in January, which was a fantastic conference. We went on a site tour of Collyhurst Village, and I popped inside to the only amenity on this very large estate. You probably can't tell, but it says fruit and veg on the front of the shop. The only vegetables inside were frozen potatoes. And this is the only access that people living on this estate have within walking distance to food. So they would need to get on a bus to go to a supermarket that would sell fruit and vegetables and other healthy foods. So we do need to have planners working together with other built environment professionals and public health in order to tackle some of these issues. But actually, it's a very interesting one because it's very complex. And by complexity, I don't mean, oh, it's complicated, it's difficult. What I actually mean is that there's lots of different elements that are interacting with each other over time and in different ways, and we can't predict what will happen with those different elements. So we have to model it and we have to understand it in a different way than we're used to, certainly in the planning profession. And public health professionals also find going into this built environment realm as a new area for them. So it is something that needs multidisciplinary working. So it's been difficult for researchers to prove that there's a causal link between different aspects of the built environment and health outcomes. So there's been a lot of really good research into things like green space, and we know that's really good for improving mental health and well-being. But we don't have very good evidence that green space actually increases physical activity. So things like that where we think, well, that's an intuitive thing, but we don't have good evidence behind it. And that doesn't mean that it won't come along. It just means that the types of research that are being done and the evidence that we have available to us today doesn't demonstrate that. Just looking at this image here, this is Hackney, Mare Street. There's been some research by the public health profession saying that it was a European cross-sectional survey of 12 cities, and they found that people living in areas with low levels of graffiti compared with those living in areas with higher levels of graffiti. For the higher levels, they were 50% more likely to be overweight. Now, that doesn't mean that living in an area with graffiti causes you to be overweight. It's a cue or it's a kind of indication of other issues, perhaps. But we need to get behind these and unpick these issues and understand how they relate together. And just looking at this image, I would probably say the impact of the people, of the condition of that housing estate and the people living on that housing estate may be much bigger than the urban art on the wall in terms of their health and well-being. And I did live around the corner in a similar housing estate for a few years and experienced Hackney, of course, is a very dynamic community with huge disparities and inequality within Hackney itself. So some of the other challenges I mentioned already about the weak evidence for causality, and that's something that's improving. There's also a lack of collaboration and also of evidence sharing and data sharing between different professions to do with health and planning. So I think these professions have different cultures, have different ways of studying. We're talking about social sciences versus natural or biomedical sciences, and they don't talk to each other very well. And so that makes it difficult for us as practitioners or researchers to take that information from academic and research and pull that into practice in terms of how do we set standards in BREEAM communities for how you should design places and communities so that they promote health and well-being. Another challenge generally about delivering healthier places is about the short-term focus on viability from the perspective of developers and on particular housing estates. So the TCPA, Kate presented earlier, have done a lot of work on reuniting planning and health. and one of their publications had a really interesting quote from a councillor in one of the councils that they were looking at, who said, "We don't want green space, we want homes, because homes will bring us money," obviously through the new homes bonus and other incentives that they will get financially. So it comes down to economics at the end of the day, and how can we make these things stack up. Of course, there's ways of doing it, and Rory just gave us a fantastic example, and we'll hear others, but those need to be replicable around the country, and we need to share the practice on those. In terms of planning and health, there's also some challenges with where public health teams sit in councils and working with planners. And in England and in the UK, public health teams have moved from primary care trusts into local authorities, which is a good move in terms of increasing collaboration. But that's only happened in some authorities, unitaries and London boroughs, that's happened, but it hasn't happened in county and district areas where they still sit in different areas. So that's difficult to allow for collaboration. And of course, the budget cuts that Chris and Kate were talking about have a huge effect on these two areas coming together. Planners, of course, have their remit, and public health officers have theirs. And bringing these two areas together isn't really a priority for either. So what are some of the potential solutions? Well, we do need better evidence and data, and that's about sharing, and as well as researchers creating and sharing that with practitioners. I mentioned that move of public health teams into local authorities. With that move, they actually lost access to a number of national health data sets that they used to be able to use. Of course, that's a real problem for us in local authorities. We need to know what are the health issues in our area, and how can we put in the right policies and strategies to deal with those. So access to data is a big issue. But going back to BRE's work in this area, we've been actually looking at what are the different national data sets available that we can use to understand the built environment's impact on health, and how can we turn that into a tool to help planners and public health practitioners work together and collaborate. And that's something we are continuing to work on with partners. So watch this space. That's forthcoming in the next few months. There's also a potential solution in terms of new policy approaches, because, as I mentioned to start off with, health is an area that cuts across climate change and energy, resources, lots of other sustainability issues. And we can actually develop policies and spatial planning solutions, design measures that are positive for both areas. And we just need to have an eye on that and think about it and make sure that things are a win-win. There's definitely a training need in terms of both professions understanding better how they can work together, and where there is good evidence to demonstrate what we should be doing now. We have a health impact assessment process in place. Some local authorities would use that on new developments. It's not very standardized, so it's just down to the luck of the draw in terms of which consultants are doing that, what kind of data they have access to, etc. So that could be improved, possibly standardized, or some type of benchmark of how we can do that in the best way. And as I mentioned earlier, with regard to the complexity of this issue, we do need to use systems thinking and also multidisciplinary collaboration in order to start to understand better how these elements work together. This is one quick example. This is from Houston, Texas, and it's a map showing the blue boxes are where there is a grocery store within a 1-mile radius of people living in those blue box covered areas. And the red dots represent, each red dot is 50 people who live in an area where there is no grocery store, obviously covering. You can see the red dots where there are no grocery stores within a 1-mile radius. So there are 250,000 low-income residents living in Houston who don't have a grocery store within a mile radius of their home, and more than 25% of these residents do not have access to a vehicle. So what they're calling these are healthy food deserts, where basically these people just don't have access to that. And as you could see from that Collyhurst Village example at the beginning of my presentation, that type of issue isn't unique to Houston, Texas. We have the same problems here in England, even in Manchester, in a city. So I think by using data, this is using data, and mapping it out spatially, public health teams and planners can start to find ways of developing policies and strategies, you can easily see how this can be a planning tool to help understand where do we need new grocery stores or what other types of issues do we need to address. So that's it for me. I mentioned this report, and there's copies outside, and there is a section there on our Healthy Cities work, and that's also kind of growing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So another different perspective in terms of this whole agenda about cities and master planning and how we make sure they're vibrant and healthy places. So carrying on this theme of throwing very diverse information at you, I'd like to invite Jacqueline to come and talk to us about ecosystems and systems.
Right, thank you. And it's been very interesting listening to the other speakers because a lot of what they've said is echoed within what I want to say, but with a very different slant. So, ecosystem services is a term that's been bandied around for a long time now. It's within the national planning framework. Spatial planners are told that they should be taking an ecosystem services approach to planning, and that's the only line within the national planning framework. So what is it? And essentially, I was sort of trying to explain it to somebody once. It's sort of like the life of Brian, look at the environment in a sense. It's what does the environment do for me? So it's a slightly different way of looking at things. We're all acquainted with strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment when we do planning. And we at MacDonald, civil engineers, we work on master planning, but we also do a lot of the environmental impact assessment for these developments. And the environment is traditionally looked at as a constraint to development. So you have an area that you wish to plan or something you want to do there, and the first thing you do is say, well, we can't do that there because of that, and that will impact on that. So the environment is looked at as a constraint and as a set of receptors, either human receptors or environmental receptors. And what ecosystem services does to a certain extent is looks at these assets of the environment as opportunities. So the National Ecosystem Assessment divided them up into various types of service: cultural, regulating, provisioning and supporting. So provisioning services within any environment are things like food and building materials. Agricultural land is a prime example. But actually in urban environments you may get other things, like you'll have cultural assets, but you can even have provisioning, because you can take genetic capital as a provision. So you have regulating services, and these are things that we need, but we don't actually recognise in our day-to-day lives, and that's things like carbon storage, water purification, and microclimate regulation within an urban environment. Then we have the cultural services, which are recreation, aesthetic, education, and then you have the supporting services, which are biodiversity and soil formation, things like that, and there are crossovers around them. And these do apply to urban environments as well. And it was very interesting, Kate earlier said something which is particularly relevant, because she described an area of Tottenham Hale, I think it was, as looking like an out-of-town commercial centre. Well, actually, our cities, the most vulnerable bits of our cities are the urban fringes, because that's where we sprawl. We have in terms of development and the developments we look at, we have regeneration of brownfield sites or previous housing, or more likely you will move out into the countryside next to the towns and the cities. And this is quite an interesting and vulnerable place, the urban fringes, because it's where we can actually get the most benefits from the rural ecosystems and feed them into the town. So we know that 50% of the global human population live in urban areas. These are places where people get the most intensive experiences of what they get from the environment they live in. But there's other things that also they don't experience, like carbon storage and water purification, that still occur, air filtration, drainage, but then but you do experience the recreation and educational opportunities. Now, living in a nice environment, as people said, is we all want to live in nice environments, and even in the Victorian times with the planting of the plane trees to get boulevards and systems like that, they realised that they had to plant things that were resilient to adverse environmental conditions, and plane trees were absolutely key to that. And they did fulfil a function in cleansing the atmosphere. So what we have, if you like, is that in a sense we've always seen ourselves as separate from our environment, that we impact on it, we influence it, but we're not part of it. We don't act. And so, if you like, what we need to start doing is becoming ecosystem engineers from a purely selfish point of view. We want to live in nice places, we want to live in sustainable places, we want to have our children grow up in nice, sustainable environments. So the important thing is to recognise what we're actually getting from those environments, what we want to keep and what we don't want to keep, and what we think are valid trade-offs. Now, working for property developers a lot of the time, one of the big issues is that it was the speaker previously said, the key is to get as many houses in as possible, because that's where you get the money. And the environment in the past has never been valued economically, and there's still major issues with valuing environmental goods. But ecosystem services lends itself to the valuation of environmental goods, because they're offering a service and you can always value a service. So I can equate it to, say, for example, we did an ecosystem services assessment in the Emirates, and it was the salination of an aquifer. And the government wanted to know how they valued that water supply. So very easy way of doing it was saying, well, if you didn't have that water supply, how much would it cost you to provide all that water that that aquifer provides? And suddenly you've got a cost of water to the people who live there, and they're going to have to pay for that. And you can apply that across. So what you're doing is you're taking the environment from being an externality into being something that's included in any economic assessment. And that's really easy to say, but it's not really easy to do. And you have to use multiple tools to do that, and it's very complex. And also, there isn't really not a need to do it in terms of like EIA and strategic environmental assessment, where there's a legislative requirement to do it when you're development. Why should you do this? Because actually, sometimes the environment isn't what you think it is, and it's not as things are not quite, the values are not quite where you think they are. So, for example, I've worked on a road scheme, for example, and we did a trial ecosystem services assessment of a dual carriageway, a very long dual carriageway, which is going through open countryside. And actually, in 60 years, we worked out, modelling using our tool, that it was actually going to be an environmental benefit over what was there already. When you take into account intensive agriculture, which has a very low environmental value, intensive water use, pesticide use, herbicide use, suddenly a road with lots of landscaping and habitat creation suddenly in the future became actually not quite so bad as it looked. especially if you factor in the fact that cars become more fuel economic over time. Now, that was just an experiment. It was a trial. But it led us to think about developing an easy-to-use tool. So Cranfield University were part of the DEFRA Ecosystem Services Toolkit project, and we sort of, Mott, MacDonald and Cranfield have been trying to develop a very easy-to-use tool to measure ecosystem services. And it's been quite interesting because we decided that the GIS-based system was much better because stakeholder engagement is very key to this process, and people are very confused about the environment and about what environmental benefits accrue. So basically, if you use ecosystem services and our tool for strategic planning options, what essentially we map is what benefits does this urban ecosystem provide now, this urban fringe, this redevelopment, what do people get out of it? What ecosystem services could it provide in the future? And which ones are worth investing in and which ones aren't? And you can make and then you can map that in and have a look at it. And I'll show you later how that works for options appraisal. Within environmental assessment, it works better on big developments, master planning, that sort of thing. The same question, what benefits do we get from this? What benefits could this ecosystem provide in the future? And what options can we put in? But the point is, the difficulty is to say, well, how do you visualise it? What do you do? And how do you iterate the designs? How do you optioneer? So what we've produced is a sort of toolkit. Now I'm going to run you through this. It's a very, oh, sorry. Which button do I press to get the film to work? This one? No? Sorry, I've got to get the film to work. Which one?
Go back to the slide video on it.
Yeah. Sorry about this, guys.
Press the left mouse button.
Did you say? That one? We haven't got it. It should come up a toolbar at the bottom. No, it's not working. Do you want to come up and see if you can get it to work? Sorry, we did try and... Did you get the film to work before? It's important, the film. Working.
Is this your memory stick?
Yes. No, it's not mine.
Okay, well, I think I have to skip.
This is the point of it. It's a real shame. Basically... Yeah? Can I just put my USB in? Do you mind? Because you've got to see it, and I know we're running late, but it's really, really important. Sorry.
You might need to cut the other slides out there.
It's in a car down the car park.
Yeah, I should go downstairs.
Very mindful of time when you say make sure.
I know. This is very, very quick, but it's quite integral to what I'm doing, so it would be really useful.
So I'll let you show the videos and might have the other slides out.
Okay. Can I get this on the USB?
Yeah, down the bottom, the one that's flashing.
Is that it? Okay. Sorry, we should have...
Let's do it together.
Can we do it together? No, it's not.
Your USB,
Yeah.
this one.
And
Local keys, is that the video?
that's the one, yeah. Okay, thank you. We can play that now.
Just a second.
That's it. Thank you.
Display.
Thank you. Okay, so what we've done is we've taken a fictitious... We're actually doing this on some planned developments, but obviously they're all at a very, very sort of sensitive stage at the moment. So we've actually fictitious part of Milton Keynes, which we've had data for. And this is a section of land that's proposed to be developed in this area on the urban fringes of Milton Keynes. And that's the existing site as it stands. And option one was, these houses are obviously very intensive, and we know that people don't do this anymore, but it was a good example. And that's option two, which is a much more fluid and better design. So we looked at what things people were getting in terms of trees, grass, buildings, water, roads. And then we changed that to option one. And then on option two, we see that obviously there's more grassland and more trees. So that's fairly inevitable. As regards carbon storage, you can see the existing landscape isn't really very good on carbon storage. Option two isn't very good on carbon storage. But to increase your sustainability regarding carbon, suddenly it becomes a very, very different picture, and you can visualise that instantly. Water yield, again, it's very important. People tend to think about sustainability in terms of, carbon, but in fact, water is often a very big constraint to development, particularly in urban areas, because you need the water supply, and BREEAM obviously is a very good method of controlling that. But if you can, in the urban fringes, regenerate the aquifers, again, so much the better. This is habitat quality, very low habitat quality for arable fields, much better in terms of the new development. But the trick of this model is it's very, very quick. You can take it in with InfraWorks, and you can actually visualise. The thing that we're trying to do is, for stakeholder engagement, is how do you visualise what benefits you can get from putting in some open spaces, some trees. And for public consultation, the public don't really quite understand what benefits they get from the environment, but they do like a nice place to live. And what you can do using this...
Are you talking about walnut tree?
Walnut tree? No. Not specifically. This is just an example.
Has the analysis been done?
Yes, yeah.
That's the place you used as your...
As an example, yeah, as a model, yeah.
So you've got statistics on that?
Yes, we've got all the statistics, yeah, that's why we did it.
Yes.
Because we had all...
Hold those questions to the end, shall we?
Yeah. But as you can...
It's important to know what we're talking about and what the context is.
Yeah. So effectively, I mean, you can... The parameters we showed you on this were just very small. They were carbon, water, and some biodiversity. But you can put all sorts of things in. And the more your library, the bigger your library, the better you can model. And what it does is it gives you a very, very good visual, a visual take on all of this. And you can actually, as I say, go right down and see what it looks like. So if you just move on, sorry, just escape and go back to the presentation. Sorry. Yeah, I've finished now. So sorry about that. The film.
Oh, no.
It's all right, go back.
And slide is...
That's it. Okay. Thank you. So if you look, for example, just in this example of the three options in terms of carbon stocks, the existing carbon was reasonably good. Option one was bad, but actually option two, which was the housing, was actually even better, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. But then you can have your trade-off. So you've traded off agricultural production for an urban fringe, but you've increased habitat quality. You've increased aesthetic quality. So it's all about making decisions about what you want from your environment. And you can account and recognise sort of environmental benefits that you didn't think you'd had. And also it gives you an opportunity to reimagine. So with using the tool that we've generated, which is a very easy to use tool, you can suddenly put in changes, and then within an hour or so, you've got a new model, and you can just see what it looks like from the point of view of the developer. And that's it really, and I'm sorry about the technical problem, but...
Thank you, Jacqueline. Now we are going to keep on this theme of trying something different. So Chris is going to talk to us about data. It sort of segues in quite nicely to our conversation this morning about how do we make the most of our data. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Martin. I've found some of the specific case studies this afternoon incredibly interesting. None more so than Aylesbury, and I'll be tuning in tomorrow to see what the decision is. I want to step back for the next 15 minutes just to look at the process of how we get to that point. So it obviously all starts with data. You've probably all heard of the data pyramid. That's where the originations of where all these decisions come from. So how do we make sense of that? And how do we end up making smart decisions in a world where there's more data and less time? So if anyone can spot the irony on this page, it would make me laugh because I'm talking about making sense of data, yet there's 3 companies listed on it, so let's clarify that very briefly. Landmark Information Group is a digital property information business, and it's part of DMG Information. They acquired Argyll Environmental, which is an environmental consultancy, in 2010, so I conveniently now find myself with 2 jobs. Exactly right. So in both of these jobs, my main challenge is to look at delivering services which help businesses make smart decisions. We all know that the corporate decision-making landscape is changing. It's in a state of flux. We have exponentially more data and an increasingly smaller amount of time in which to use it. So that's the challenge. How do we make smart decisions with more data and less time? So I'm going to explore the growth of data and the contraction in time that we have as an introduction. Then I'm just going to draw on 3 examples about how we've managed to start that process in our business. So the concept of big data conceptualizes this explosion in information. If anyone can offer up a succinct and concise summary of what that means, I would love to hear it. I've got no idea. It's a very difficult concept to articulate, so I did what everyone does and look at Wikipedia, and that's what it says. So even then, my journey wasn't finished. I did what everyone does and underline the important bits to simplify it even more, and that's what it looked like. So the point is that big data just means that what we have available is growing more and more and more, and it's actually quite scary, and it's not going away. The challenge is only going to get harder. This is what it looks like when you put it on a graph. And interestingly, if you use the inverse of this as an indicator of the time that we have available, this is what it looks like. So in the greenish colour, you've got the growth of data. In yellow, you've got the reduction in time that we have to use it. Now, when you do this, it creates something really quite interesting, because I think that this symbolises that we're now, for the first time, in a period of transition where we are past the crossover point. We have to find solutions now that deliver information and data analysis in less time than what we have available currently. That's the challenge. And for the purposes of the next 10 or so minutes, that's what I'm going to term this, is the crossover. So the good news to meet this challenge is that our computing power is keeping pace. We've got the technology available that helps us hold all this stuff, that helps us store it and use it. That's the positive. Quite where it leads us is a debate for another day, and towards the singularity, which is quite a scary thing. The bad news is that a lot of this information is unstructured, unordered. It's not in a nice library that we can wander around and access what we need. So all of this lends us to a place, I promised my daughter I would put the slide in, where we don't actually know what to do with the stuff that we've got. I don't think I'm alone in loading up the Google search engine page and staring into the abyss and not quite knowing what to put into the search engine. So at Landmark, we've recognised this shift, and we're now focused not just on data, but on how we deliver services that help people use it in this climate. Our mantra is that if it's not as simple and clear as it can be, then our journey isn't finished. So I just want to pick out a handful of examples of the types of people that we work with, just to symbolise how we're starting this process. So architects and surveyors is the first one. Now, in their simplest sense, architects and surveyors design and value the built environment. And we interact with them predominantly through a platform called ProMap. Now, before the crossover, ProMap existed in a very simple world, and this is what it looked like. We essentially helped architects and surveyors digitise boundary plans. That's it. Now, because of the pressures in time and resource, we're trying to help them in their workflow. So we're introducing things into that platform that help them decide what they should build and where. Whereas before, they would just come to us once they've made those decisions. So things like 3D mapping, things like height data, all of these things are part of the process now. So it helps at the origination of the question as opposed to once it's been answered. So it speeds the process up. The second group is asset managers. And asset managers is essentially a generic term for anyone who manages property portfolios. That could be utility companies, that could be private fund managers or pension providers. Before the crossover, asset managers did have a lot more time to consider environmental risk. When I say a lot more time, in their world that means days instead of weeks or months. And if they were brave enough to ask for that information, they would get a stack of reports a mile high. And all of those reports would be talking different languages and saying different things. Things like further action required, or low to moderate risk of contamination, or moderate environmental sensitivity. I'm a technical consultant at heart, and even I don't know what all them things mean. So it was no surprise that essentially it wasn't a go-to consideration for them to bring it into their decision making. So what we've tried to do is simplify that process and deliver services on top of the data which help them do that. So essentially, this is, in one slide, an environmental risk analysis for 14,000 properties in a BS9 district down in Bristol. Traditionally, before the crossover, if you wanted that information, it would come in 14,000 reports. We can now do it in one slide. And this is a similar thing for ground stability, and this is the visual output of all of that information. So it becomes easier to digest. And just as one example of how we need to, in business, convert things into the right language, I just want to run through two scenarios with you. So if we imagine that we're asset managers and we've got to report to our client what the risk is from a site, we've got two options. Option one is this. There is a moderate to high risk of contamination at the site. That means it is a site which, from the information assessed, is considered to have the potential of being affected by a contaminated substance present in or under the site, such that on the basis of its current or proposed use, there is a reasonable likelihood of a regulatory authority acting in accordance with relevant legislation requiring that remedial measures are taken in order to remedy or mitigate the contaminated substances that are present in or under the land. That's option one. Option two, there is an 18% likelihood that remediation is needed, and if required, it will cost £790,000. Show of hands for option one. Please, somebody put their hand up. Show of hands for option two. So it's all about how we translate information. So the third group is environmental consultants. We interact with environmental consultants on a platform called EnviroCheck, and again, before the crossover, EnviroCheck existed in a very simple world where we solved a problem that nobody provided environmental information all in one place. So a developer that wants to know the contaminated land risk, the flood risk, the ground stability issues, all these kind of things in their design, didn't know where to go to get it. So we delivered that, and it's a good job that in those days there was a lot of time to look at this stuff because it was reams and reams and reams of information. But now with the growth of digital, open source data, we've gone past the crossover, and this is now what it looks like. So it's the same amount of information, the same amount of data, it's just on a platform that clients can use and personalise. And now we've made it so that you can interact with it as well, so that when you're on site walking around the Aylesbury estate, for example, and you're trying to mark where you want trees or where there's drains or ditches or all these other considerations, you can plot that on your platform and then go back to the office and it's already there. So it's about joining up technologies and making things faster, which it doesn't sound like a lot, you know, if you can get to your data from 3 clicks against 3 minutes, but that's a marginal gain, and Sky built a very successful cycling team around that mantra. So the last group is conveyancers, and conveyancers are essentially anyone acting on a property transaction, so solicitors predominantly. And before the crossover, they existed in a simple world, the days of paper files reaching to the ceiling and reports on every single property, and they were the boom days for storage companies and fire management plans. And after the crossover, they did exactly the same thing, and it didn't work. The reason it didn't work is because it took too long, it cost too much money. So what was the solution? Essentially, they decided upon sampling as the way to get around this problem. So instead of looking at all of the 1,000 properties, we'll just look at 100, and that was generally the ratio that they used. That then led to a problem which this formula illustrates. I'm not a mathematician, I hate formulas, and I don't think we need to use this to prove that sampling is dangerous. If you're a business and you sample, you open up potential negligence claims, knowledge gaps, all this kind of stuff, and it doesn't work. So what we did in the conveyancing space is deliver a solution where you get all of the data on all of the sites. You just only get it in detail on the sites where there's a potential issue that you need to know about. So as long as you're comfortable that the knowledge is there and the data is there, then you get a simplified output. So that's how it worked. So just to look back to the question I posed at the start, is that how do we make smart decisions with more data and less time? We definitely don't have all the answers, but we understand that this is happening, and we're starting to try and build services that combat this. So the title of the presentation was Making Sense of Data. Probably the real irony is that data is only the beginning. So I referenced the data pyramid at the start. That's the journey that we all need to go on. So we need to use data to get information, to then build knowledge and to build wisdom. In cities, we have an opportunity to do that. We can build feedback mechanisms in, and that's what we should be aiming to do. So we know that conventional approaches are no longer valid. So to finish with one that existed at the dawn of time, an old Chinese proverb: when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and other people build windmills. This is definitely a room of windmills, so let's keep them spinning. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So our last presentation in this series now is from Lydia from Argent. We started with Rory with a case study, so to keep our feet on the ground, we're going to finish with a case study for King's Cross. Over to you, Lydia.
I grab myself a glass of water and you can watch me doing it. I just thought it might be a good idea if everyone should just stand up for a moment. Shake yourselves out, have a look out the window, turn around. I need to remember to pour some water. And then you can just sit down again when you're ready, because I'm just going to get myself sorted. I'm going to give it a go. There we go. Right, hopefully that was enough of a moment to bring you all back into the room. I know that I'm actually the last element before some refreshments and a chance to relax and chat about all of the things that have been going on today as well. So what I'm really proud to be doing today actually is talking to you about King's Cross as a case study of regeneration in the City of London. I recognise from the examples that we've had earlier on in this session that we do have the benefit of, if you're in London, then you actually have relatively high land values and opportunities that you might not get externally. But actually what I wanted to demonstrate through this presentation is actually that really thinking about the future and how people are going to be using space and using place and making an environment that people want to be in from the very beginning of a development, that actually you can start seeing some results early on before you've even finished. And one of the accolades that we won last night, and I'm going to do my very best to do it justice today, is that last night at the Property Week Awards we won Most Innovative Development in the last 20 years. And so I'm going to do my best to try and convey the innovation that has come through over the last we started working on it in 2000 and how we've got to where we are 15 years later and the development that's still going. So this gives you just a bit of a snapshot of what we're looking at creating over that started and we've been working on for the last 15 years and still have another 5 to 7 years to go in actually development. But to give an overview, I'm just going to start with a snapshot of Argent, then go on to King's Cross and sustainability and how we're creating the place and the space, and then we'll be moving on to questions and answers. So first, Argent. I've been at the firm for 2.5 years, so I can't claim to have been integral to moving it to where it is today. It started in 1981, working on commercial, residential, educational, cultural and community projects since then, most known for projects up in Manchester and Piccadilly Place, and also in Birmingham for Brindley Place. But London and King's Cross has been really our piece de resistance of being able to actually put ourselves on the map as a developer that goes through the whole process from development through the construction process and then out the other side, and we're actually doing the asset management now as well. But the key pieces to pick up on this slide are just around the fact that we're creating place and trying to create value, as well as making sure that we're working in partnership with the communities and the businesses around where we're developing as well. But on to King's Cross. Argent were identified as the preferred developer in 2000, and in 2000 and by DHL and London Continental Railways, that were the original landowners. A partnership called the King's Cross Central General Partnership Limited was formed in 2008, which really pulled together all of those parties into one partnership with a commitment and equity into making this development a place for people and to make it work both viably from a financial perspective, but also from a human scale and from what people, a place where people would want to be living and working. And then I've just put on Australia Super as well, as they came in to the partnership a few weeks ago, and that's been a really interesting piece of work over the last few months within the business to demonstrate the values and the benefits and the long-term future of King's Cross that would enable further investment, and some interesting challenges for me as well from an environmental manager perspective, with Australia Super having many questions about the environmental governance and the plans that we have around making sure that it's a sustainable development. King's Cross itself has a real benefit of being in the location of a fantastic transport hub, with King's Cross and St Pancras having been developed with £2.5 billion worth of transport upgrades, £200 million of improvements on the underground, the six links that are going through the station as well. So we're really on a fundamentally good sound basis for developing a sustainable site, having good infrastructure to enable us to develop and get people to us sustainably, and another aspect of King's Cross. We also have the development that's going on around the King's Cross site as well. We've got King's Place, Regent's Quarter, the Francis Crick Institute that's going to be finished in the near future as well, bringing thousands of scientific researchers to the area, as well as the British Library, and UAL Central St Martin's was the first occupier on the site in 2011. But it just gives you an idea that things are happening in and around King's Cross, rather than it just being us on an island on our own. This is actually quite a good visual to be able to see the size of the development. We're 67 acres to the north of the King's Cross and St Pancras stations, which fortunately for us was a relatively brownfield site, which meant a good platform upon which to put in new structures, a new cityscape that will really kind of link in with the rest of Islington and Camden that's surrounding it. This gives you an idea of what we're actually going to be building over the time, hopefully completing around 2021 of the buildings themselves, so 22 office buildings, 8 million square foot in total, with 24% of that being residential. That equates to 2,000 homes, a good amount of retail and culture and education. And what this slide really shows is that it's not just one thing or another, it's actually getting a real mix of uses, so that we're not just creating an 8 till 7 environment where people arrive and commute into and then disappear. It's actually about creating places that people want to be throughout the day and throughout the week as well. This is just an example, or showing you what's been completed by the end of 2014. One of the key aspects of master planning and the phasing and the approach that was taken in deciding how King's Cross was going to come forward was actually around making sure that the public spaces was were the start of that, with a kickstart to creating a place that people want to be at. Granary Square was first. Sorry, the writing's incredibly small as that's come up. This is Granary Square just here in front of the University of the Arts. That opened in 2011, and we've just had Cubitt Square and Cubitt Park to the north open up as well, and it's just making sure that people are able to come and recognise it as a place even before all of the buildings are created. And then this is just a visual of the estimated completion in 2020. There's been quite a few references to the Victorian era and the conditions that were actually created in that time around then, and actually that was the heyday of King's Cross. There was a huge amount of infrastructure brought in. This is where the heart of the coal was coming in, the food from the north, and then to be transported on the canal networks and out into the centre of London. And actually one of the key benefit, or a really interesting aspect of King's Cross, is the amount of heritage that's both been kept on site and also recognised as iconic, and an opportunity to bring the communities that recognise that the granary, for example, and the gas holders that have been relocated, that they are actually ingrained as part of the vision, how people recognise King's Cross as a place. And that's just an example of the transformation. So we've gone from Victorian and the canal basin there to Granary Square, where there's fountains that are an homage to the canal basin that it once was. And this is actually when it was the Romans versus Boudica weekend that we had. So there's an attempt at recreating Rome there. But one of the things really is about accessibility as well, and making sure that people are aware of what's coming to a place, where they can get to it from. You can see there just at the bottom of the screen is actually the Regent's Canal, and ensuring that's being opened up and used by both people wanting to come into and out of the King's Cross site, but also enable people to pass safely through the site as well, and reopening that for connectivity in and around London. About creating the new destination, but I can go on about that forever. But this is actually one of where I get a bit excited, is actually the commitment from the business at the very beginning to creating a sustainable development. And what does that actually mean? And it's actually creating a place that has lasting economic, environmental and social benefits to the wider community. And a huge amount of work was put into understanding what the community wanted and needed. Back in 2000, we were a preferred developer, as I've mentioned. Then from 2001 through to 2006, when we actually achieved planning, the amount of work that went into 4,000, I think it's contact points with the local community, businesses that were engaged. And the document there that's in the far left-hand corner for you guys, Principles for a Human City, was written in 2001, which really pulled together 10 principles for how the managing directors and partners of Argent really believed that you could create a place and a space that people would want to live in and would go on in longevity through these key principles around a robust urban framework, a lasting place, accessibility, connectivity, making sure that it's not just King's Cross as an island on its own, but working for the whole of London, creating businesses and creating jobs, but then also making sure there's that connectivity to the local area as well. And key to this as well is engaging and inspiring. And one of the aspects that's been referred to earlier is around secure delivery. We're not just going to start the development part and then finish part way through and say, oh, well, we're off, we're leaving. It's about making sure that we've got financial systems in place to make sure that we can secure delivery and make it happen. Sustainability was key throughout the whole of planning. One of the really interesting stories that I find, I'm just going back to a picture of the site, is the connectivity and the 20 new streets and roads that were introduced at the very start of the master planning process. It wasn't about which buildings can we create and how high can we make them. It was about the different streets and the different roads and the ways in which people could interconnect across the site from the external part, as well as making sure that there's enough open space for people to be able to interact and come together. So that was one of the purposes around having the Granary Square. We have Pancras Square and the Cubit Square and Park as well. And I think I do quite a lot of work around habitat and biodiversity and making sure that we have the green spaces, but for fitness and for health and for well-being. But actually one of the brilliant things that's happening in Cubit Square at the moment is that we have a boot camp that happens on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that's on hard landscaping, but you probably couldn't do that actually on grass everywhere. So it's a really good way of enlivening and getting people on a development to get active around having those open spaces. Although I'm aching a bit today. Just moving through. This is the visual of the first sustainability report that was pulled together last year, which really captures how we look at sustainability within King's Cross. It's not just about making sure that the buildings are green and that the carbon footprint's low, which we do have a 50% target on 2005 levels to achieve, but actually it's also about the regeneration aspects. And I wanted to take a moment actually to mention that when planning was achieved back in 2006, a lot of concern and consideration was about making sure that we have all of the carbon targets and energy targets, and making sure that we're creating an infrastructure to make us resilient, which is core and really, really important. But I think the work that both the Argent team, the Camden planning team and the Islington planning team and everyone that was working together on the King's Cross strategy and master plan actually recognised that place and heritage, the economy and employment, education and wellbeing and community were all fundamental to that as well. And that's something that there were a few comments earlier today around data and the frustrations around planning and helping them move forwards, but actually this collaborative approach back in 2001 to 2006 was actually really, really important to getting us to where King's Cross is today, and it's making sure that we're communicating on that as well and collecting the data, which is an interesting giggle that I find in my day-to-day job as well. Having said all that, I've just got a few slides on the infrastructure that has been put in place at King's Cross. We have an energy centre on site, which sits and has been installed already from the very beginning. We've laid all of the pipe work for all of it's close to 99% of the heat and hot water demand will be provided by 3 Jenbacher engines that obviously generate electricity, but the resulting heat is actually providing, as I said, all the heat and hot water. But this building itself isn't just an energy centre. Next year it's going to be completing as a multi-storey car park. It's going to have a community sports facility in there, and then it's also got home houses, townhouses and flats on top. So it's really working that space and making sure that we've got the full consideration of that land as well. How much time do I have? I can keep talking. Couple of minutes. Okay, I won't tell you, but perhaps we can speak after about why the engines are pink. But you can come and talk to me about that later. There's just a visual there of the pipes and the infrastructure and everything that's been included. This is the bridge that connects Granary Square to King's Boulevard, and just really illustrates all of the groundwork that's been put in to try and minimise the amount of road digging that has to happen once development's completed. BREEAM Outstanding or Excellent offices. I've got 5 Pancras Square just here has just received 97 0.06% in BREEAM bespoke, which I believe is the second highest BREEAM rating in the UK, and something we're incredibly proud of that Camden committed to as it's their development. But also we have one pancras which has also achieved BREEAM outstanding, and two pranks as well. So it's something that we only have a planning permission or planning requirement to achieve very good, but wanting to go beyond and push for brilliant offices as well. The next trick or challenge is to make sure that they're operating as we're hoping for them to do. It's creating the green and pleasant lands around King's Cross as well. We have the gas holder number 8, which is going to be park and public space, and actually the primary school that's opening in September, it's going to be their main point of play area and open space. So it's going to be, I mean, imagine being this high and looking up and having the gas holder. Anyway, it's exciting. I'm nearly there. Key thing is community. I mentioned earlier about the drive and the importance placed on bringing the communities together. One of the key aspects of that is Global Generation Skip Garden that's been in 4 different locations on the site. It is, as is said, it's the skips, gardens in skips, and using those as tools to engage local children alongside our contractors, alongside those working in the development, bringing everyone together to learn about the sustainability journey and all of our parts to play in both sustainability from a growth perspective, but sustainability from a social perspective as well. There's some good pictures there of the King's Cross Detectives, a schools programme, as well as the Construction Skills Centre that's in there as well, with trying to bring local kids opportunity to get apprenticeships on site. But ultimately, it's about creating places for people. Sounds cheesy, but actually, it's really what we're trying to do. And myself and the regeneration team, we're working to enliven the spaces and bring people to come and see the site for themselves. And we had a bit of a Latin lesson at the beginning of the day, and I apologise if I say this incorrectly, but I suppose nihilus. It's don't just take it my word for it. Come and see it. That's it.
So thank you for those speakers. A very, very diverse bunch of presentations. I promised at the start we would save some time for questions. We've overrun a little bit, but we still do have time. So I'm going to follow Lydia's lead and stand up, actually. Don't worry, I've noticed you waving hand, but let's get everybody standing here, shall we, in terms of who've presented. I think it's probably going to be better than sitting down anyway. So you want to go first, I know.
John Burke from Zero Energy. Can I ask each one of you in turn why you should be putting mature trees into all your developments as part of the city? Jacqueline touched on it. The Victorian spotted that the plane tree picks out soot from the atmosphere. It now gets rid of most of the rubbish coming out of our buses. So can we each have a chat about trees and how important they are?
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first because we have lots of trees, and we've just installed actually just in the end of December our 50-year-old oak that's been grown in Germany specifically to come to Argent or to the King's Cross development. So it's a mature tree, and in fact most of the trees, we've got lime trees, we've got plane trees going up the King's Boulevard, and it's certainly something that our public realm team really are promoting and making sure that we get in place. Fox hornbeam, sorry. But yes, so that's an easy one for me to answer. Rory, there you go.
Well, I think mature up to a certain point. You know, you want trees that are going to survive the whole construction process and then, you know, be useful thereafter. And obviously from then on, they're useful as carbon sequestration, managing the microclimate, all the other good things. There are lots of statistics about the value that trees add simply to the sales value of development. So in all our developments, we try and keep as many of the trees that are there as possible, irrespective of whether or not they're TPO'd or have other issues. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that the trees are ones that are going to last a very long time, and you're not jumping through hoops to protect and keep trees that frankly will only last 10 or 15 years. So a lot of judgment to be gone through.
Anybody else want to come in?
I'll just say briefly. Yeah, on the health side, obviously. I think the Mayor commissioned a report on air quality in London in 2008. There were 4,000 deaths alone in 2008 related to air quality. Of course, double check the figures, that's from memory, but it is in that region. And trees obviously do play a very positive impact on air quality in terms of absorbing particulate pollutants and things like that. So absolutely would promote trees.
Do you want to?
Thanks, yeah, it's a great question. Quite simply for me, I think my answer would be that it makes us all feel better. It reminds us that we're connected with nature. But yeah, there's a sustainability element to the consideration, so it's got to be the right tree for the right building design and area design. But absolutely, yeah, it just makes us feel like we're in touch with nature.
Well, going back on the ecosystem services, we're trying to go for multiple benefits. And obviously we know what trees can do for us. But one of the other things that they do, for example, urban developments on the edge of floodplains, trees will slow down surges of water and will absorb the flood water more effectively. So, and the bigger the tree, the better they work.
Exactly.
So more benefits you probably even realise then sometimes. So more questions?
Sarah Cousin from the Chartered Institute for Business Studies, and specifically Lydia really. So you're saying to go see it for yourself. I have seen the development and it's beautiful. And I've got a colleague who works in Camden Council buildings. It's the best place she's ever worked. Have you actually looked at the performance of the other buildings in your development in terms of post-occupancy evaluation, how they're performing in terms of energy and carbon, but also for the kind of health and well-being of people in those buildings?
Yeah, that's definitely a work in progress at the moment. Most of our buildings have actually only, well, the big office buildings have only been occupied for a year. So it is something that we're working on, particularly from a BREEAM perspective, just making sure to achieve BREEAM Outstanding, you actually have to go back and make sure that you're doing reviews and understanding how people are using the space and how they're performing. So yes, it's something that we definitely are doing. I'm not saying that we've got all the answers yet, and certainly certain aspects have been more difficult to gather the information on than others, but it's completely what we're doing and wanting to do.
So what do we expand that question? What about post-occupancy?
Oh, go for it.
Go on then,
Yeah.
I was going to say, what about post-occupancy of communities? Should we be looking at communities and going back to see if they function as we design them?
Well, I think there's a group called, I think, Social Life, who are surveying the residents on the Aylesbury estate now, and then they're going to go back every 4 or 5 years, I think, for the next. Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So how do you make sure over the long term that that kind of analysis is carried out thoroughly and in the same way? Because it'll probably be done by different people and in different circumstances. But yes, the question is, what questions do you ask? Who do you ask the questions of? It's not as straightforward.
It's not as static, it changes over time, isn't it?
So I've just thought of something else as well. One of the ways that we're engaging at the moment is we've got an environment forum which all of the occupiers can come along to, and actually we're trying to work together to work out how as an estate we can be one estate and make a difference from an environmental perspective, and how we can engage each of our different colleagues to think about the environment and how they're using the space, as well as working with the building managers from a technical perspective and how the user is experiencing the space from a heat and from a cool perspective.
So that's really interesting. So that idea of building performance, sorry. And will you be actually publishing your information? Because you know that just because something has a BREEAM badge on it doesn't mean it actually was constructed and is performing to its design intent. So you have this huge performance gap in buildings.
Yeah.
So will you be actually looking, so you've got quite a lot of different types of buildings there. Instead of just saying we've got BREEAM excellent or outstanding, that could mean anything or nothing.
Yeah.
Are you looking at actually sharing the hard performance data? This is what the intent was. It's like with district heating and energy systems, people often find they don't work as intended. So looking at being quite honest and doing those lessons learned, and it might be going all really well, and that's another thing to shout about.
Yeah.
Are you looking at that
Good
honest?
question.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and actually something that I'm currently working on the second sustainability report. The first one, it was very much a kind of, these are our principles, this is what we're trying to achieve. The second one is going to be more around, these are our baselines and what have we achieved so far, and then look with a view to actually setting the targets to make sure that we're reducing year on year, and that's kind of in line with our approach of ISO 14001 and just making sure that we are going to be continually improving, because buildings don't, hopefully everyone in the room is aware that buildings don't necessarily perform as you're expecting them to. And I think one of our challenges is around, even with all of the commissioning works and the joined up approach, we're still not necessarily getting everything right first time. And I think I've been on an 18-month journey with our design, M&E design teams, with our commissioning teams, and with our building managers as well, to understand how a meter needs to be put in correctly.
Great. Gentleman there, I know, desperate to ask a question. Okay.
Lodi, I'm Dean at the University of Suffolk. As we were talking about urban ecology and the ecological systems, I mean, one of the ills we found about cities nowadays is the urban ground water systems. So how much in your, because you have relatively large projects, how much you reinstated the original urban streets? I mean, Melbourne, as you mentioned, Australia as well. Melbourne is going through a major project now to reinstate urban streets, groundwater urban streets, because we found that related to trees, related to everything. So how much of that emphasis you put in your projects?
You've also captured the imagination of people, haven't you?
Yeah.
Urban streams?
Urban streams.
Go on.
Water, urban streams. One of the things, hopefully this isn't dodging the question too much, is actually looking to use the buildings that we're actually creating from a rooftop perspective. So we're capturing from green roofs and brown roofs that we're putting up there to actually make sure we're doing water attenuation from that perspective. Also doing rainwater harvesting in the buildings for all of the the flushing of the lavatories. With regards to water on site, I mean, Granary Square and Cubitt Square and Handyside Gardens, they all have a connection to water at the fountains, and there is a stream going through, but I'm pretty confident it's not exactly what you're referring to. But beyond that, I'm not really able to go into too much more detail. The canal, of course. Yeah, so there's obviously the canal. Thank you. A kilometre of canal that we're opening up.
Any more questions for others on the panel here? Gentleman there.
It's Mott from RSK. Question for Chris, actually. You gave an entertaining conclusion to 2 land quality assessments. I've written things nearer the first than the second. The second was a much better conclusion, but obviously embodies some fairly interesting commercial risks when you're that clear and precise. Let's say, how do you deal with being that precise with clients who may not always be very kind on the comeback when you're slightly wrong?
Yeah, that's exactly the main consideration with translating it into a different language and making it financial. So making contaminated land risk a financial parameter is difficult, and that's, I think, why our industry uses terms like moderate risk. Does anyone know what moderate risk means? It's kind of nothing, and that's why it exists as a concept for that very reason. So yeah, there's a massive amount of caution that needs to be used in how you translate that into numbers, and kind of reflecting on the data pyramid, we're still only at a point, I think, as an industry where we're scratching the surface of how we can present that and how focused we can be with those numbers. So there will always be caveats, there will always be considerations that you need to make. So we're only just starting a process where we can categorically translate it into something meaningful. But yes, it's riddled with problems, I think, is the summary.
It seemed to get at one of the problems with data. That's a really clear piece of data. It's a nice figure. You can use that, you can process it, but unless you have a reasonable handling of what that means, and you're willing to embed that within your processing, that becomes incredibly difficult and perhaps slightly misleading.
It's a good challenge back, I think. Peter, I know you asked.
Peter Garay, Belgium. This morning we heard smart cities is about smart data and handling it smart in a smart way. I wonder if and how in those 2 projects you mentioned, you explained how you dealt with that. Did you really already take those smart data into your planning? Because I didn't hear that in a way.
I think with ours it's too early, simply because until we have a permission to go from here on, in other words, we've probably done 50% of the design work. So from now on, assuming things go well tomorrow, we will then get into the detailed design of all the utilities and the detailed design of all the buildings, and then we'll start construction in about 8 to 10 months, something like that. So I think a lot of that is in the next stage, the detail of how we specify all the systems, the CHPs. Ours are definitely going to be pink as well. So we get all the benefits of the urban environment we're creating, and so we get the feedback that this lady was looking for, so that we know, after say 5-10 years, what the air quality is like, so that we know how people are using cars. Over that long-term period, what we want to do is we want to drive down the ownership and use of cars. So part of that will be tracking the number of car users, where they're used, what the levels of traffic are on the streets within the development, and so on.
You're going to have to answer the question why pink CHP plant, I think.
Okay. Now? Okay, I'll answer your question first. Just with regards to data, a really good example that I can bring that was talked about actually this morning is the City Insights programme that was discussed earlier. The way in which we're starting with that is actually having a heritage trail around the development, so that people can actually walk around and understand what the buildings that they're looking at used to be, or what used to be there, and actually get in some real insightful information as to what's gone on in the past. And that's really our first foray into using data that's available and sharing that electronically and easily with the public. My aspiration is that we then move that forward into actually how are the buildings performing and how can people access that information relatively quickly. That's something I've still got to discuss with the board, but the platforms are being set up at the moment. Another example is energy management and what's coming out of the buildings. And we've just been working with a company called Carbon Credentials over the last 18 months to actually enable all of the information that's being generated from all of the smart meters that have gone into the building as part of Part Helen and BREEAM, to make sure that it's all being consolidated into one place for us to enable to then, so that's the easy bit, so then we can do some analysis and make sure that the buildings are doing what they need to do. So the data is being pulled in into a consolidated place, but it's the next challenge is making sure we do something with it, and something that's interesting, both from what can we learn from it, but also communicating to the wider industry as well. Does that answer the question?
Fantastic. So, and why pink?
The pink engines. The engines are pink actually due to one of the project directors who was working at Argent at the time of deciding that we'd go with the Jenbacher engines, was fundraising for breast cancer research. And rather than just getting the engines shipped or lorried over on their own, actually everyone did a sponsored cycle from Austria to London and cycled with the engines all the way back, raising I think about £35,000 for breast cancer research. So that's why they're pink, and they're all going to be pink.
So I'm going to stop there. We now have a coffee break, so and then we're back here I think about 4:15 for the last workshop. But can you thank the panel again for an excellent session? I'm sure if you've got questions, these guys will be around for a little bit longer, so feel free to talk to one on one-to-one.